In this video, we'll examine the most notorious couples in American criminal history. These were lovers, spouses, and partners in crime who committed murder together and faced the ultimate punishment side by side. We'll explore what they did, their final meals, and the last words they spoke before meeting their fate. Welcome to Primetime Crime. Warning: viewer discretion is advised. Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck. In 1947, a deadly romance began that would terrorize lonely hearts across America. Raymond Fernandez was a smooth-talking con man who preyed on vulnerable women through newspaper personal ads. But when he met Martha Beck, everything changed. Martha Beck was a 27-year-old nurse from Florida when she answered Raymond's ad in 1947. She was desperate for love and immediately fell under his spell. When Raymond visited her in Florida, Martha told everyone they were engaged. She was so obsessed with him that when he returned to New York, she abandoned her 2 young children and followed him north. Raymond confessed his criminal schemes to Martha, expecting her to leave. Instead, she sent her children to the Salvation Army and devoted herself completely to him. Together, they perfected a deadly system. Martha posed as Raymond's sister, giving him an air of respectability that lonely women trusted. Their victims felt safer knowing there was another woman in the house, but Martha's jealousy was explosive. She couldn't bear the thought of Raymond being intimate with their victims. When he did sleep with a woman, both the victim and Raymond faced her violent rage. The killing started in 1949 when 66-year-old Janet Fay became engaged to Raymond and moved into his Long Island apartment. When Martha caught Janet in bed with Raymond, her jealousy erupted into murder. Martha attacked Janet in a jealous rage with a hammer, and together the pair ended her life. When Janet's family became suspicious about her disappearance, the couple fled to Michigan. There, they met 28-year-old Delphine Downing, a widow with a 2-year-old daughter. The little family welcomed the brother and sister into their home. On February 28, 1949, Delphine became agitated. Raymond gave her sleeping pills to calm her down. When the 2-year-old daughter saw her mother's drugged state and began crying, Martha's rage exploded again. In Michigan, the couple turned violent again, first against Delphine and later her child, both of whom they tragically killed. They buried both bodies in the basement, but neighbors had noticed the Downings' sudden disappearance. On March 1, 1949, police arrived at the door. Raymond quickly confessed to everything, and the couple was extradited to New York, where the death penalty still existed. They were tried only for Janet Fay's murder, and both sentenced to death. On March 8, 1951, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were strapped into the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison. Martha's final meal consisted of fried chicken, fried potatoes, and salad. Raymond refused to eat anything. In their final moments, witnesses reported that the Lonely Hearts killers declared their love for each other one last time. At the same hour on the same day, both Raymond and Martha were pronounced dead. Their twisted love story had claimed at least 3 innocent lives, but investigators suspected the true number was much higher. Just 2 years later, another criminal couple would make headlines when they committed what was then the largest ransom kidnapping in American history.
Last time a woman was executed for a federal crime was back in 1953, and the similarities don't end there. That case also involved a kidnapping and murder in the Kansas City area. Bonnie Heady was put to death for her part in the killing of 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease.
Carl Hall and Bonnie Heady. September 28, 1953, started as an ordinary day at Notre Dame de Sion, a Catholic preschool in Kansas City, Missouri. 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease was the son of a multimillionaire auto dealer. His family's wealth made him the perfect target for a desperate criminal couple. Carl Hall was 34 years old and had attended military school with Bobby's adopted older brother in the 1930s. For years, he had planned to victimize his former classmate's wealthy family. His partner was 41-year-old Bonnie Heddy, a drug-addicted alcoholic who lived with Hall in nearby St. Joseph. Together, they devised a plan that would horrify the nation. On that September morning, Bonnie walked into Bobby's school and approached Sister Morand. She claimed to be the boy's aunt and told the nun that Bobby's mother had suffered a heart attack and was in the hospital. The unsuspecting nun allowed Bonnie to take Bobby away in a taxi. When another nun called the hospital to check on the boy's mother, she discovered the truth. The FBI was immediately contacted, but it was already too late for Bobby Greenlease. Hall and Heddy drove the child across state lines into Kansas, where Hall murdered him with a .38 caliber revolver. They had never intended to return the boy alive. Bobby was murdered before the ransom demand was even issued. The couple buried Bobby's body in the backyard of Heddy's house in St. Joseph, then sent a ransom demand for $600,000, the largest in American history at the time. The kidnapping and murder scandalized the entire nation. Because Bobby had been taken across state lines, it became a federal case under the Federal Kidnapping Act. The FBI's investigation quickly led them to Hall and Heddy. Both criminals pleaded guilty to kidnapping. The jury deliberated for just 1 hour and 8 minutes before recommending death sentences for both. On December 18, 1953, Carl Hall and Bonnie Heddy were executed together in Missouri's gas chamber.
Since his death, 35 states and the federal government have reinstated the death penalty. The gas chamber was first introduced in California in 1938.
Only 81 days had passed between the crime and their executions. Neither Hall nor Heddy made any attempts to appeal their sentences. Both chose chicken for their final meal. As they were prepared for execution, witnesses reported that Hall and Heddy exchanged "I love you" as their final words. At the time of her death, Bonnie Heddy became only the third woman ever executed by federal authorities. Their crime had lasted less than a day, but it destroyed multiple families and shocked a nation. That same year, another couple would face federal execution for a very different kind of crime, one that would divide American opinion for decades. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The height of the Cold War brought fear and suspicion to 1950s America. In this atmosphere of paranoia, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg became the center of one of the most controversial espionage cases in U.S. history. Julius Rosenberg was born in New York on May 12, 1918. He worked as an engineer for the U.S. Army Signal Corps. His wife Ethel was born Ethel Greenglass on September 28, 1915. She worked as a secretary. The couple met as members of the Young Communist League, married in 1939, and had 2 sons together. On June 17, 1950, Julius was arrested on suspicion of espionage. Federal agents accused him of heading a spy ring that passed top-secret atomic bomb information to the Soviet Union. 2 months later, Ethel was also arrested. The case against them was built largely on the testimony of Ethel's younger brother, David Greenglass. He was a former Army sergeant who had worked as a machinist at Los Alamos, the secret atomic bomb laboratory in New Mexico. Greenberg had already confessed to providing nuclear secrets to the Soviets through an intermediary. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he testified against his sister and brother-in-law. The trial began on March 6, 1951, and attracted massive media attention. The Rosenbergs vigorously protested their innocence throughout the proceedings. After a brief trial, both were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. On April 5, 1951, the judge sentenced Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to death. The couple was taken to Sing Sing prison to await execution. For the next 2 years, their case became the subject of intense national and international debate. Protesters argued that the death sentences were cruel and unusual punishment, especially for Ethel, whose involvement appeared minimal. But many Americans supported the executions. President Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to grant executive clemency, stating that the Rosenbergs may have condemned to death tens of millions of innocent people all over the world by increasing the chances of atomic war. On June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed by electric chair at Sing Sing prison. They were not offered special final meals and ate the standard prison food that day. Both maintained their innocence right up to their final moments, with witnesses reporting that their last words were continued denials of any wrongdoing. Julius was executed first at 8:04 p.m. Ethel followed 3 minutes later. The Rosenbergs became the first U.S. citizens to be convicted and executed for espionage during peacetime. Their case remains controversial to this day, with many arguing about their guilt or innocence and whether the death penalty was appropriate. But the Rosenbergs weren't the first American couple to face execution together. That grim distinction belonged to a husband and wife in the Old West, where frontier justice was swift and unforgiving. Josiah and Elizabeth Potts. The year 1890 marked a dark chapter in Nevada's history, when the state executed its first and only female defendant alongside her husband. Josiah and Elizabeth Potts were an unlikely criminal couple who would meet their fate on the same gallows in Elko County. Elizabeth Potts was born Elizabeth Atherton on December 21, 1846. Her marriage to Josiah Potts carried a secret that wouldn't be revealed until after their deaths. The couple was convicted of killing 57-year-old Miles Fawcett, a British-born man whose death and brutality of the case shocked the Nevada frontier community. Details of their crime painted a picture of brutal violence that horrified even frontier residents accustomed to rough justice. After their conviction, a special double gallows was manufactured in Placerville, California, specifically for their execution. Invitations were issued for the June 20, 1890 event, treating the execution almost like a public spectacle. Friday morning, June 20th, dawned bright and clear. The community was swept with frenzied excitement as people came to town, mostly reporters, sheriffs, and former sheriffs. Of those invited to witness the hanging, 52 men came to watch. No women were allowed. All their requests were turned down. At 10:30 a.m., officers offered the condemned couple a small bottle of alcohol. They accepted the drinks after a brief prayer by Reverend C.J. Porter. When the death warrants were read, Elizabeth lifted her right hand and declared, "Innocent, so help me God. We are innocent, that's all we can say. We are innocent from first to last." They were given another stiff drink before being led from the jail to the gallows yard. Elizabeth was dressed in a white dress with black silk bows at her throat and wrists. Josiah wore a business suit. The couple climbed the gallows steps calmly, while a silent crowd watched grimly. Their legs were strapped and their shoes removed. Before the black hoods were placed over their heads, the couple leaned forward and kissed affectionately one final time. As the nooses were placed around their necks, Josiah kept murmuring, "Lord, have mercy on me." Elizabeth appealed, "Lord, have mercy on my soul." Sheriff Barnard tripped the trapdoor at 10:44 a.m. At the execution, the drop caused a gruesome outcome for Elizabeth, who was dressed in white, which horrified witnesses at the scene. Josiah slowly turned around 2 or 3 times, his legs contracting once before he died. At 11:08, Elizabeth was cut down and turned over to the undertaker. A few minutes later, Josiah was placed in a coffin next to hers in the back of a wagon. They were buried together in the local cemetery. Only after their deaths did the full story emerge. Elizabeth had been in a bigamous marriage, carrying secrets that, if revealed during their trial, might have saved them from the gallows. The hanging of Josiah and Elizabeth Potts would be remembered as the last legal execution in Elko County. It also marked the only time in Nevada's history that a woman has ever been executed. The case captured the imagination of the frontier public, becoming a symbol of the harsh and unforgiving justice of the time. More than a century later, the story of Josiah and Elizabeth Potts still lingers as one of the strangest and most tragic criminal episodes in Nevada. Unlike many other notorious couples who committed their crimes in the 20th century, their tale belongs to the rougher, rawer world of the Old West, where secrets, betrayal, and violence collided on a public stage, and where even in death, the Potts couple remained bound together. Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore. The early 1980s brought a different kind of criminal partnership to Florida's highways, where desperation and violence would create one of America's most infamous female serial killers. Aileen Lee Carol Wuornos was born February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. Her childhood was a nightmare of abuse and abandonment that would shape the killer she became. Her father was convicted of child molestation and later killed himself in prison. Her mother abandoned Aileen and her brother, leaving them with their grandparents. Aileen's grandfather beat her regularly, while her grandmother battled alcoholism. By age 11, Aileen was trading sexual favors for money, beer, and cigarettes. She had her only child at 14. Neighbors claimed the father was an older friend of her grandfather. The child was given up for adoption. At 14, Aileen's family kicked her out. She began living in the woods or hitchhiking around the country, often using fake names. In 1986, Aileen's life took a dramatic turn when she met Tyria Moore at a bar in Daytona Beach, Florida. The two women began an intense romantic relationship that would last until just before Aileen's final arrest in 1991. Together, Aileen and Tyria sold stolen items at Florida pawn shops. While Aileen worked as a prostitute to support them both, Tyria remained largely unaware of the darker turn their criminal activities were about to take. By 1989, Aileen's prostitution work had evolved into something much more deadly. She turned to lethal violence against her clients, later claiming it was in self-defense. Her first known victim, Richard Mallory, was discovered in December 1989. Over the next year, 6 more middle-aged men would be found dead along Florida's highways. The murders followed a pattern. Aileen would offer sexual services, then rob and kill her clients with a firearm before taking their cars, money, and personal belongings. Police discovered items belonging to Richard Mallory at local pawn shops, with receipts showing Aileen's thumbprint. They traced other stolen items from the victims back to people and businesses Aileen had contacted. By 1990, Tyria Moore had become suspicious of Aileen's activities. She moved back to Pennsylvania to live with her family, putting distance between herself and the increasingly unstable situation. When Aileen was arrested on an outstanding warrant at a biker bar in Harbor Oaks, Florida, police tracked down Tyria and used her to elicit a confession. Unlike the other couples in our story, Tyria would not share Aileen's fate. She cooperated with authorities and was never charged. Aileen Wuornos was convicted of killing 6 men and sentenced to death. On October 9, 2002, Aileen was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She declined her final meal, which could have been anything under $20, and instead received only a cup of coffee. Her final words were bizarre and rambling. "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll Be Back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th like the movie. Big mother ship and all, I'll be back, I'll be back. At 9:47 a.m., Aileen Wuornos was pronounced dead. She became the second woman executed in Florida, and the 10th woman executed in the United States since the restoration of capital punishment in 1976. After her death, Aileen's body was cremated. Her ashes were scattered beneath a tree in her native Michigan by her childhood friend. At Aileen's request, Natalie Merchant's song Carnival was played at her funeral. She had spent many hours on death row listening to this album. Unlike the other couples who died together, Aileen faced her final moments alone. Tyria Moore had long since moved on, leaving Aileen to pay the ultimate price for their crimes. Teresa Lewis and Matthew Schallenberger. October 30th, 2002, started like any other morning in Danville, Virginia, until a frantic 911 call shattered the quiet. At 3:55 a.m., Teresa Lewis called the sheriff's office, hysterically reporting that her husband and stepson had been shot by an armed home intruder. When authorities arrived at the scene, they found 25-year-old C.J. Lewis dead inside their home with multiple injuries. In the master bedroom, 51-year-old Julian Lewis was gravely wounded and passed away soon after paramedics arrived. Near Julian's body, investigators discovered multiple shotgun shells. Outside the back door, there was a shoe impression that didn't match any shoes from inside the home. With a recent string of burglaries in the area, authorities initially wondered if this was a robbery gone wrong. But Teresa's version of events didn't add up. Teresa claimed she had been awakened by a noise and saw someone standing at the end of their bed, though she couldn't get a clear look at the intruder. She said she ran into the bathroom and barricaded herself inside while gunshots rang out throughout the house. But investigators noticed something unsettling about Teresa's demeanor. She was oddly calm while recounting the brutal attack on her family. When the autopsy reports came back, one detail stood out to authorities: the timing of CJ's death. This happened around 3:15, and Teresa didn't call 911 until 3:55, Deputy Harris Silverman noted. 45 minutes seemed like an extremely long time to wait when her loved ones were bleeding to death. The investigation soon revealed a much darker truth. Teresa Lewis had been having an affair with 22-year-old Matthew Schallenberger, a man she had met at a Walmart where she worked. But this wasn't just adultery. It was a carefully planned murder scheme designed to collect CJ's $250,000 life insurance policy that he had taken out as an Army reservist in anticipation of his deployment to Iraq. Teresa had given Schallenberger money to buy the murder weapons and provided him with details about the house layout and the family's routines. On the night of the murders, Teresa left the back door unlocked so Schallenberger and his accomplice, Rodney Fuller, could enter the home. After initially denying involvement, Teresa eventually confessed that there had been a second shooter, Fuller, whom Schallenberger had recruited to help with the killings. The plan was cold and calculated. Teresa stood to gain financially from both her husband's death and her stepson's substantial life insurance policy. But the scheme quickly unraveled under police investigation. Both Schallenberger and Fuller reached plea deals in exchange for cooperating against Teresa. They received the life sentences. Teresa also pleaded guilty, hoping to avoid the death penalty. But for the 2 charges of capital murder, she was sentenced to death anyway. The case sparked debate about executing women and questions about Teresa's mental capacity. Some argued her low IQ should have protected her from the death penalty. In 2006, Matthew Schallenberger died by suicide behind bars, never living to see Teresa's execution. On September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center. Her final meal consisted of 2 fried chicken breasts, sweet peas with butter, a Dr. Pepper, and apple pie for dessert. In her final statement, she addressed her stepdaughter, Kathy Lewis Clifton, who had come to witness the execution. "I just want Kathy to know that I love you, and I'm very sorry." At approximately 9:13 p.m., Teresa Lewis was pronounced dead. She became the first woman executed in Virginia since 1912 and would be the last, as Virginia abolished capital punishment in 2021. Unlike many criminal couples who died together, Teresa faced her final moments alone, her partner in crime having taken his own life years earlier. Before we continue with perhaps the most shocking case of this video, I wanted to talk about how to protect yourself from a much more likely attacker, an online attacker targeting your and your family's personal information, and that's with today's sponsor, Aura. Aura is an all-in-one digital security service that protects you from identity theft, fraud, and scammers, the ones who buy and sell your name, address, and banking information on data broker websites. I Googled my own name recently and found dozens of sites selling my old addresses, phone numbers, even the information of my relatives. Aura automatically scans those sites and sends removal requests on your behalf before you become a victim of an online attack. They also monitor the dark web, alert you to suspicious banking activity, and protect your devices with a secure VPN and antivirus. And if something does happen, Aura's got you protected with $5 million in identity theft insurance and 24/7 US-based support. You can try Aura completely free for 14 days with my link at aura.com/primetimecrime. You can find my link in the description and comments below. Please check it out and see who is selling your information right now. Thanks again to Aura for supporting the channel and protecting us while we're online. Now back to the video. Carla Faye Tucker and Danny Garrett. June 13, 1983, started as another night of drugs and partying for 2 young criminals in Houston, Texas. Carla Faye Tucker was 23 years old, a prostitute and drug addict with a history of violence. Her partner in crime was Danny Garrett, a man who shared her taste for methamphetamines and mayhem. That night, they decided to burglarize the apartment of Jerry Lynn Dean, a man Tucker knew and had been having problems with. What happened next would shock even hardened investigators. Tucker and Garrett broke into Dean's apartment expecting to find it empty. Instead, they discovered Dean asleep in his bed. Rather than flee, the drug-fueled pair decided to end his life. Tucker grabbed a pickaxe from the apartment and began to attack Dean while he slept. She later described disturbing feelings of excitement during the violence. But they weren't finished. Hidden under a pile of blankets in the same room was Deborah Ruth Thornton, a 32-year-old woman who had been visiting Dean. When Tucker discovered the terrified woman, she felt no mercy. She continued her attack with the weapon on Thornton, ending her life as well. Tucker later told friends that she had experienced satisfaction with each swing of the pickaxe. The brutality of the murders, combined with Tucker's sexual excitement over the killings, horrified investigators. In September 1983, Tucker and Garrett were indicted for murder and tried separately. Tucker was charged with both murders, but after she testified against Garrett at his trial, the charge for Thornton's murder was dropped. Both were sentenced to death and sent to their respective death rows. But Tucker's story took an unexpected turn while awaiting execution. Soon after being imprisoned, Tucker took a Bible from the prison ministry program and began reading it in her cell. She later recalled, "I didn't know what I was reading. Before I knew it, I was in the middle of my cell floor on my knees. I was just asking God to forgive me." Tucker claimed to have become a born-again Christian in October 1983, just months after her brutal crimes. In 1995, she married her prison minister, Reverend Dana Lane Brown, by proxy, and held her Christian wedding ceremony inside the prison. Her religious conversion and gender made her case internationally famous. Foreign government officials and religious leaders pleaded for her life to be spared. But Danny Garrett would never see the execution chamber. He died of liver disease on death row in 1993, 5 years before Tucker's scheduled execution. Tucker, however, would face her fate alone. On February 3, 1998, state authorities flew Tucker from her cell in Gatesville to the Huntsville unit for execution. For her final meal, Tucker requested a simple selection: a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. She selected 4 people to watch her die, including her sister, her husband, and a close friend. When strapped to the gurney, Tucker's final words were recorded by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. She praised Jesus Christ and expressed love for her family and her victims' families. As the lethal injection began taking effect, Tucker praised Jesus, licked her lips, looked at the ceiling, and hummed quietly. At 6:45 p.m. CST, 8 minutes after receiving the injection, Carla Faye Tucker was pronounced dead. She became the first woman executed in Texas in 135 years, and only the second woman executed in the United States since the restoration of capital punishment. Unlike many criminal couples, Tucker faced her final moments without her partner. Garrett had escaped earthly justice through death, leaving Tucker to pay the price for both their crimes. Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown. The summer of 1984 brought terror to the American Midwest as a violent couple embarked on one of the most vicious crime sprees in modern history. Alton Coleman was born November 6, 1955, and had accumulated a long criminal record even before he met Deborah Brown in 1983. Nearly a decade earlier, he had a record of violent crimes, including sexual assault on a woman, and spent time in prison. Psychiatrists determined that Coleman was willing to display dangerous behaviors toward women, men, and even children. His fixation on dominating victims made him extremely dangerous. Despite this dangerous history, Coleman was released from prison and later acquitted of subsequent rape charges in 1976 and 1980. Deborah Brown was born November 11, 1962. Unlike Coleman, she had no history of violence before meeting him, but experts would later describe their relationship as master-slave, with Coleman completely dominating the younger woman who had a low IQ ranging from 59 to 74. Together, they would commit crimes that shocked even experienced investigators. Their spree began on May 29, 1984, when they approached 9-year-old Vernita Wheat in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and convinced her to take a ride with them. Although the FBI began pursuing the couple the next day, little Vernita's body wasn't found until June 19th. The day before Vernita was discovered, Coleman and Brown struck again in Gary, Indiana. 2 young girls, ages 7 and 9, were walking near their home when the couple abducted them. Both children were assaulted. One managed to escape, but the other tragically lost her life. The murderous pair had now established their pattern. They targeted the most vulnerable victims: children, elderly people, anyone who couldn't fight back effectively. Coleman and Brown turned up next in Detroit, Michigan, where they began a systematic campaign of home invasions and car thefts. On July 2nd, Coleman beat a Detroit couple with a pipe in their own home, stealing their vehicle. 5 days later, Virginia Temple and her daughter were later found dead inside their Toledo, Ohio home. Their next victim was a 15-year-old girl in Cincinnati. On July 13th, they bludgeoned a woman to death and stole her car. In Lexington, Kentucky, the couple abducted 2 men, but were somehow talked out of killing them, a rare moment of restraint in their campaign of terror. The final victim of their rampage was 77-year-old Eugene Scott of Indianapolis, who was killed in his car on July 18th. By now, Coleman had been added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in a special 11th slot reserved for actively dangerous fugitives. On July 20th, 1984, the couple was finally apprehended in Evanston, Illinois. Their 2-month spree had left 8 people dead and many more injured across 6 states. Coleman and Brown faced multiple trials across the country. Coleman was ultimately sentenced to death in 3 different states, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, making him the only condemned person in America with death sentences in 3 states. Brown was also sentenced to death in Illinois and Indiana, but her sentences were later reduced due to her low IQ and the master-slave nature of her relationship with Coleman. On April 26, 2002, Alton Coleman was executed by lethal injection at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. For his final meal, he ordered an elaborate feast: a well-done filet mignon smothered with mushrooms, fried chicken breasts, salad with French dressing, sweet potato pie with whipped cream, French fries, collard greens, onion rings, cornbread, broccoli with melted cheese, biscuits and gravy, and cherry Coke. So many victims and survivors wanted to watch Coleman die that prison officials had to set up a closed-circuit viewing venue outside the execution chamber. Coleman's final words were a recitation of Psalm 23, the famous biblical passage beginning, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." At the time of his execution, Coleman had released a letter apologizing for his crimes, though officials said he never directly expressed remorse. Deborah Brown was spared execution. Her death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment without parole and 140 years respectively. Despite her nonviolent history before meeting Coleman, Brown was initially unrepentant. During her sentencing, she sent a note to the judge that read, "I killed the bitch and I don't give a damn. I had fun out of it." She is currently serving her sentence at the Dayton Correctional Institution in Ohio and finally expressed remorse for her crimes in a 2005 video. The Coleman and Brown case demonstrated how a dominating personality could corrupt someone with no previous history of violence, turning them into an accomplice to mass murder. Dustin Honken and Angela Johnson. July 1993 brought a series of murders to rural Iowa that would eventually make federal death penalty history. Dustin Lee Honken was born March 22, 1968, and by the early 1990s had become a major methamphetamine manufacturer in the Mason City area. His girlfriend, Angela Jane Johnson, was born January 17, 1964, and would become his partner in one of the most calculated mass murders in Iowa history. The couple's crimes were rooted in Honken's expanding drug empire and his determination to eliminate anyone who might testify against him. When federal investigators began building a case against Honken's drug operation, several of his dealers agreed to cooperate with authorities. Honken and Johnson decided that these potential witnesses had to be silenced permanently. On July 25, 1993, Greg Nicholson, a former dealer who was scheduled to testify against Honken, disappeared along with his girlfriend, Lori Duncan, and her 2 young daughters, 10-year-old Candace and 6-year-old Amber. The family had simply vanished from their home, leaving behind all their possessions. A few months later, on November 4th, another potential witness, Terry DeGias, also disappeared. All 5 victims were murdered in unincorporated woodland outside Mason City, and their bodies buried in remote locations. The murders were methodical and cold-blooded. Honken and Johnson had systematically eliminated everyone who posed a threat to Honken's drug operation. For years, the case remained unsolved. The victims' families wondered what had happened to their loved ones, not knowing they had been killed to protect a criminal enterprise. Although Iowa had abolished capital punishment in 1965, this became a federal death penalty case because it involved a continuing criminal enterprise. When the case finally went to trial, both Honken and Johnson were sentenced to death. Johnson became the first woman sentenced to death by a federal jury since the 1950s. However, Johnson's death sentence was overturned in 2012, and she was resentenced to life without parole in 2014. Honken's case moved through the appeals process for years while he remained on federal death row. During his time in prison, Honken converted to Catholicism. The Archbishop of Newark even wrote to President Donald Trump asking him to commute Honken's sentence, citing his spiritual growth in faith and compassion. On July 17, 2020, after the Trump administration lifted the federal moratorium on executions, Dustin Honken was executed by lethal injection. Details of his final meal were not made public, as federal executions rarely publish such information. His final words were a recitation of the poem Heaven Haven by Gerard Manley Hopkins, followed by Hail Mary, Mother of God, Pray for Me. At 3:36 p.m. CDT, Honken was pronounced dead. He became the first defendant from Iowa to be executed since 1963. Angela Johnson remains in federal prison, serving life without parole for her role in the murders. The Honken-Johnson case demonstrated how drug money could corrupt couples into committing mass murder to protect their criminal enterprises. Charles Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate. In the winter of 1957, a 19-year-old garbage collector and his 14-year-old girlfriend would embark on a killing spree that horrified America and inspired countless books, movies, and songs. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born November 24, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was a troubled young man with a violent temper who idolized James Dean and saw himself as a rebel without a cause. His girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate, was just 14 years old when their relationship began. She would later claim she was an unwilling hostage, but prosecutors argued she was a willing participant in murder. Their killing spree actually began in November 1957, when Starkweather robbed and killed gas station attendant Robert Colvert. But the murders that made them famous started on January 21, 1958. That day, Starkweather went to visit Fugate at her family's home in Lincoln. When her mother and stepfather told him to stay away from their daughter, his rage exploded. Starkweather shot and killed Velda Bartlett, Fugate's mother, and Marion Bartlett, her stepfather. He then strangled Fugate's 2-year-old half-sister Betty Jean. When Fugate came home from school, she found Starkweather waiting for her with the 3 bodies hidden throughout the house. What happened next remains disputed to this day. Fugate claimed that Starkweather told her the family was being held hostage and threatened to kill them if she didn't cooperate. She said she didn't know they were already dead. Prosecutors argued that Fugate was a willing participant who helped cover up the murders and participated in the subsequent killing spree. For the next 6 days, the couple stayed in the house with the bodies, turning away visitors and maintaining the fiction that the family was sick with the flu. On January 27th, suspicious relatives forced their way into the house and discovered the bodies. By then, Starkweather and Fugate had fled in a stolen car, beginning a killing spree across Nebraska and Wyoming. Their next victims were 17-year-old Robert Jensen and 16-year-old Carol King, 2 teenagers on a date who were forced into an abandoned storm cellar and shot to death. The couple then invaded the home of wealthy businessman August Meyer, a friend of Starkweather's family, and ended his life, Next, they broke into the home of industrialist C. Lauer Ward, taking out Lauer, his wife Clara, and their maid Lillian Fensel. Their final victim was traveling salesman Merle Collison, who was murdered when Starkweather tried to steal his car on a Wyoming highway. When a passing motorist stopped to help, Starkweather couldn't get Collison's car started. The helpful stranger realized something was wrong and wrestled Starkweather's rifle away from him. A sheriff's deputy arrived and arrested both Starkweather and Fugate, ending their 8-day reign of terror. 11 people were dead, and America was transfixed by the young couple who had killed without apparent remorse. At trial, Starkweather initially said he had kidnapped Fugate and that she had nothing to do with the murders. But he later changed his story and testified against her, saying she was a willing participant. Fugate maintained her innocence, claiming she had been held hostage by threats against her already dead family. The judge didn't believe her story, noting that she had numerous opportunities to escape or seek help. Starkweather was convicted of murder after the jury deliberated for 22 hours. On May 23, 1958, he was sentenced to death. On June 25, 1959, Charles Starkweather was executed in the electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary in Lincoln. He declined the customary steak dinner and instead requested assorted cold cuts for his final meal. Starkweather gave no formal last words at his execution, but in a letter to his parents from prison he wrote, "But Dad, I'm not real sorry for what I did cause for the first time me and Carol have more fun." He was reportedly indifferent about his impending death and had become resigned to his fate. At 12:04 a.m., Starkweather was pronounced dead. Half an hour before the execution, the doctor who was supposed to pronounce him dead had suffered a fatal heart attack, requiring a replacement physician. Carol Ann Fugate was convicted as an accomplice and received a life sentence on November 21, 1958. She was paroled in June 1976 after serving 17.5 years in prison. Unlike the couples who died together or within years of each other, Fugate would live for decades after her partner's execution, maintaining her innocence and trying to rebuild her life. The Starkweather-Fugate case became one of the most notorious crime stories of the 1950s, inspiring works of art while raising questions about youth violence, media coverage, and the nature of criminal partnerships. Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell. November 15, 2017, started as an ordinary day for 24-year-old Sydney Loof as she prepared to leave work at a Lincoln, Nebraska Menards store. Sydney had matched with someone on Tinder and was excited about meeting for a date in the small town of Wilbur, about an hour away. She had no idea she was walking into a trap set by two predators who had been using dating apps to lure young women into dangerous situations. Aubrey Trail was 54 years old and had a long criminal history involving forged checks and fraud schemes. His much younger girlfriend, 23-year-old Bailey Boswell, had become his willing accomplice in increasingly serious crimes. Together, they had been operating what prosecutors would later describe as a scheme involving the manipulation and exploitation of young women through dating apps. When Sydney failed to appear for work the next day, her family immediately knew something was wrong. She was a responsible young woman who would never miss work without calling. Police began investigating her disappearance, tracking her last known activities to the Tinder date in Wilbur. For 3 weeks, the search for Sydney continued while her family held on to hope that she might be found alive. But on December 4, 2017, hunters discovered her remains scattered along a gravel road 60 miles from where she had last been seen. The discovery launched a massive investigation that would eventually lead police to Trail and Boswell. Store receipts and video evidence tied the couple to items linked to covering up the crime. Cell tower data revealed that they had followed Sydney on the night of her date. When confronted with the evidence, Trail began making multiple confessions, though his stories kept changing. Initially, he claimed he had acted alone in killing Sydney. He even proclaimed his wish to be executed for her death, referencing what he called the law of retaliation. In a subsequent confession, he alleged that Sydney had died during a third date with Boswell on November 16th. In yet another version, he claimed the three were supposed to participate in an intimate encounter where he would be with two women, and that Sydney had accidentally died during the encounter. In a fourth confession, he recanted some of his previous statements but maintained that Sydney's death had been accidental. At one point, Trail told the FBI that his job was making videos for people with specific preferences, claiming he was paid to create content and that he knew such activities could be dangerous. However, some of Trail's confessions proved credible to authorities. When he told them where he had thrown Sydney's smartphone, police found her phone, driver's license, and credit card at Wilbur's Czech Cemetery, exactly where he said they would be. On June 11, 2018, both Boswell and Trail were charged with first-degree murder and accused of concealing her body. Prosecutors announced their intention to seek capital punishment for both defendants, though both pleaded not guilty initially. The prosecution later added conspiracy to commit murder to the charges. In June 2019, Trail pleaded guilty to the charge of improper disposal of Sydney's remains. But at the end of that month, a frustrated Trail created a dramatic scene in court. He lashed out at the court and jury, proclaimed Boswell's innocence, and then injured himself with what appeared to be a razor blade. Though his wounds were not life-threatening, Trail missed portions of his trial due to his refusal to appear in court. It took the jury less than 3 hours to convict Trail of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and improper disposal of human remains. Trail's request for a new trial was rejected by Judge Vicki Johnson. Boswell's trial was moved to a different venue due to prejudice concerns, and she was convicted in October 2020 on the same charges. In June 2021, a 3-judge panel unanimously sentenced Trail to death. Boswell received a life sentence after one judge determined that her actions did not meet the standard of exceptional depravity required for capital punishment. Trail appealed his sentence and sought to represent himself, but this request was denied. Both Trail and Boswell remain incarcerated as of 2024. Trail sits on death row at the Tecumseh State Correctional Institution, while Boswell serves her life sentence at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women. Unlike many of the couples in our series, Trail and Boswell have not yet been executed. Trail's death sentence continues through the appeals process, and there are no final words or last meals to report. Their case represents the modern reality of death penalty prosecutions, lengthy legal procedures that can take years or decades to complete. Sydney Loof's family continues to await final justice while the legal system moves through its prescribed course. The Trail Boswell case demonstrates how dating apps and modern technology can be weaponized by predators to find and exploit victims, turning what should be safe social interactions into deadly traps. Chad and Lori Daybell. September 2019 brought the beginning of a case that would shock America with its combination of religious extremism, family destruction, and cold-blooded murder. Chad Daybell was a self-published author of apocalyptic fiction who claimed to receive visions about the end times. His future wife, Lori Vallow Daybell, was a mother of 3 who became increasingly obsessed with his doomsday teachings. Together, they would form what the media described as a doomsday cult that would ultimately claim multiple lives, including those of Lori's own children. The case began when 16-year-old Tylee Ryan disappeared on September 9, 2019, followed by her 7-year-old adopted brother Joshua J.J. Vallow on September 23rd. Their mother, Lori, showed no concern for their whereabouts and gave conflicting stories about where they might be. Lori had been married to Charles Vallow, but their marriage had deteriorated as she became increasingly involved with Chad's religious beliefs. Chad taught that certain people were dark spirits who needed to be eliminated before the second coming of Christ. Lori began to believe that several people in her life, including her own children, fell into this category. On July 11, 2019, Charles Vallow died during a violent confrontation involving Lori's brother, who claimed self-defense. Just months later, Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, died suddenly in her sleep on October 19, 2019. Her death was initially attributed to natural causes. Chad and Lori married just 2 weeks after Tammy's death, raising suspicions among family members and investigators. When relatives became concerned about the missing children and contacted police, Lori claimed they were staying with relatives or friends, but investigators could find no trace of Tylee or JJ, and Lori's stories kept changing. In November 2019, police served a search warrant on Chad and Lori, demanding to see the children. When they could not produce them, both fled to Hawaii, where they were eventually arrested. The search for the missing children intensified, focusing on Chad's property in Rexburg, Idaho. On June 9, 2020, investigators made the grim discovery they had feared. They eventually uncovered the children's remains on Chad's property. Evidence showed their deaths were concealed in disturbing ways. The investigation also revealed that Chad and Lori had developed an elaborate belief system that justified killing people they deemed to be dark spirits. They believed they were preparing for the end times, and that eliminating these individuals was necessary for their spiritual mission. Evidence showed that they had also been involved in the deaths of Charles Vallow and Tammy Daybell, as well as an attempted murder of Lori's nephew-in-law, Brandon Boudreaux. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, who was believed to have participated in multiple murders, died before he could be brought to trial. Both Chad and Lori were charged with multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. Lori was convicted of murdering her children and conspiring to murder Tammy Daybell in May 2023. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chad was convicted of murdering Tylee, JJ, and his wife Tammy in May 2024. The jury recommended the death penalty, and he was formally sentenced to death in June 2024. After her sentencing in Idaho, Lori was extradited to Arizona to stand trial for additional charges related to Charles Vallow's murder and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. Acting as her own attorney, she was found guilty on both charges and received 2 additional life sentences in July 2025. As of 2024, Chad Daybell remains on death row in Idaho while his appeals process begins. Unlike the other couples in our series, neither Chad nor Lori has been executed. Chad's death sentence is just beginning its journey through the appeals courts, a process that typically takes many years. There are no final words or last meals to record because Chad's execution has not yet occurred and may not happen for years, if at all. The Daybell case shocked America not just for its brutality, but for the way 2 parents could convince themselves that killing their own children was somehow justified by their religious beliefs. Justice has been served in the form of their convictions and sentences, but the ultimate punishment for Chad Daybell remains years away, if it comes at all. The victims, especially young Tylee and JJ, will never see their futures, while their killers continue to breathe behind prison walls, their final fate still undetermined by the slow wheels of justice. Ray and Faye Copeland. The 1980s brought a grim discovery to rural Missouri that would shock investigators and make criminal history. Ray Copeland was born in Oklahoma in 1914 and grew up during the Great Depression, when his family constantly moved around struggling to survive. As a young man, he began a life of petty crime, stealing livestock and forging checks, until he was caught and served a year in jail. After his release in 1940, he met Faye Wilson, and they married soon afterward. They quickly had several children, but Ray's criminal reputation meant the family had to keep moving while money remained tight. Ray served several more jail sentences before finally developing what he thought was the perfect scam. Because Ray was well known as a fraud, he couldn't buy and sell cattle legitimately. To get around this problem, he began picking up drifters and hobos, employing them as farmhands on his property in Mooresville, Missouri. He would take these employees to livestock markets, where they would use his bad checks to buy cattle for him. After the transactions, Ray would sell the cattle quickly, and the farmhands would simply disappear without a trace. For a while, the scam worked perfectly, but eventually police caught up with him and Ray was sent back to jail. Upon his release, he resumed his criminal activities, but this time he made sure his farmhands disappeared permanently. The truth began to unravel in August 1989, when a former employee named Jack McCormick called the Crime Stoppers hotline with a disturbing story. McCormick claimed he had seen human bones on the Copeland farm while he was employed there. Even more frightening, he said Ray had tried to kill him. Police were initially skeptical, but after checking Ray's extensive criminal record, they decided to investigate further. In October 1989, dozens of officers accompanied by bloodhounds visited the Copeland farm with a search warrant. At first, they found no incriminating evidence, but after more thorough searching, the remains of several young men were eventually located on or near the property. As the search continued, more bodies were found, and all had been killed with the same weapon. Evidence tied the killings to a firearm found in the Copeland home. The investigation revealed Ray's deadly evolution from check fraud to murder. When his farmhand employees had served their purpose in his cattle scam, he simply killed them to eliminate witnesses. But Faye's role in the murders initially puzzled investigators. When Faye went to trial in November 1990, her defense painted a picture of her as a dutiful wife and mother who had endured years of beatings and abuse from her husband. The defense argued that she was another victim of Ray's violence, forced to go along with his crimes out of fear. However, the prosecution presented evidence that Faye had been an active participant, helping to lure victims and dispose of evidence. The jury convicted her of 5 counts of first-degree murder. At age 69, she was given 4 death sentences and 1 life sentence. In March 1991, Ray faced his own trial. He was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to death at age 76. Together, they became the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States. When told that Faye had also been sentenced to death by lethal injection, Ray showed no emotion and replied coldly, "Well, those things happen to some, you know." But neither Ray nor Faye would ever face execution. Ray died of natural causes on October 19, 1993, while still on death row. His body was cremated. There were no final words or last meal. Death came naturally before the state could carry out his sentence. Faye remained the oldest woman on death row until 1999, when her attorneys successfully appealed her death sentence. They argued that the jury had not been allowed to hear evidence that Ray had physically abused her for years, forcing her participation in his crimes. On August 6, 1999, Judge Ortree D. Smith overturned her death sentence but let the conviction stand, commuting her sentence to 5 consecutive terms of life without parole. On August 10, 2002, Faye suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. Weeks later, Governor Bob Holden authorized medical parole for Faye, fulfilling her one wish that she not die in prison. She was paroled to a nursing home in her hometown of Chillicothe, Missouri, where she died of natural causes at age 82 on December 23, 2003. Like her husband, Faye never faced execution. She died peacefully in the nursing home, having avoided both the death chamber and dying behind bars. She left behind 5 children and 17 grandchildren. The Copelands case demonstrated how financial crimes could escalate into serial murder, but unlike the other couples in our series, neither faced the ultimate punishment they had been sentenced to receive. Gerald and Charlene Gallego. Between 1978 and 1980, a deadly couple terrorized young women across California, Oregon, and Nevada in their twisted search for what prosecutors called the perfect sex slave. Gerald Armand Gallego was born July 17, 1946, and had violence in his blood. His father had been executed in Mississippi's gas chamber when Gerald was just a child. Gerald himself had a long history of sexual violence and criminal behavior before he met the woman who would become his partner in horrific crimes. Charlene Adele Williams was born October 19, 1956, and came from a middle-class background that contrasted sharply with Gerald's criminal history. When they began their relationship, she was drawn to Gerald's dangerous charisma, unaware that she was about to become part of one of the most brutal serial-killing sprees in American history. The couple's method was calculating and cruel. Charlene would lure their victims to their vehicle, typically offering to sell them drugs or asking them to help distribute flyers. Once the victims were close enough, they would be restrained and forced into the car. Gerald would then subject the victims to horrific abuse before ending their lives. Their first known victims were Rhonda Scheffler, 17, and Kippy Vaught, 16, who were abducted from a shopping mall in Sacramento in September 1978. The girls were later found deceased in a rural area. Over the next 2 years, the couple would claim at least 10 victims, ranging in age from 13 to 22. Their victims included Brenda Judd, 14, and Sandra Colley, 13, who were kidnapped from the Washoe County Fair in Nevada in June 1979. Each crime followed a similar pattern. Charlene would approach young women or teenage girls with friendly offers of help or opportunities. The victims, seeing another woman, felt safe enough to approach the couple's van. Once abducted, victims were never seen alive again. The killing spree continued across state lines, making the investigation complex and difficult for law enforcement agencies trying to coordinate their efforts. The couple's reign of terror finally ended in November 1980, when they were arrested after witnesses identified their van in connection with their final victims. Craig Miller, 22, and Mary Beth Sowers, 21, had been abducted from a fraternity dance at Sacramento State University. Both were found shot to death in remote locations. After their arrests, Charlene made a strategic decision that would save her life but doom her husband. She accepted a plea bargain, agreeing to testify against Gerald in exchange for a reduced sentence. In February 1983, she was sentenced to 16 years and 8 months in prison in Nevada. Gerald, meanwhile, decided to represent himself during his 4-month trial in California. Despite his legal maneuvering, he was found guilty and sentenced to death on June 21, 1983. Following a second trial in Nevada, he was again found guilty and sentenced to death on June 25, 1984. Though this second death sentence was temporarily overturned in 1997, it was reinstated in 1999. Charlene served her sentence at Warm Springs Correctional Center and was released in July 1997 after 14 years in prison. She disappeared into anonymity, reportedly changing her identity and starting a new life away from the notoriety of her crimes. Gerald remained on death row at Ely State Prison in Nevada, but he would never face execution. In March 2002, he was diagnosed with colorectal cancer that quickly spread to his lungs and liver. He was transferred off death row to receive treatment at Renown Regional Medical Center, but refused any efforts aimed at prolonging his life. Gerald chose to be sedated with painkillers rather than fight the disease. On July 18, 2002, one day after his 56th birthday, Gerald Armand Gallego died of cancer while under medical care. Gerald never faced the execution chamber. There were no final words or last meal. Disease claimed him before the state could carry out his death sentence. Charlene, having cooperated with prosecutors, had avoided the death penalty entirely and lived as a free woman. The Gallegos became known as the sex slave killers, a nickname that reflected the particularly depraved nature of their crimes. James DiVeggio and Michelle Michaud. December 2, 1997, started as an ordinary morning for 22-year-old Vanessa Leigh Sampson as she walked to her job at an insurance company in Pleasanton, California. She had no idea that two predators were hunting for their next victim, or that her routine walk to work would end in unimaginable horror. James DiVeggio was 43 years old and had a long history of sexual violence. His partner in crime was 39-year-old Michelle Michaud, a woman who had become his willing accomplice in a spree of sexual assaults and murder. Together, they had spent their 13-month relationship in 1996 and 1997 terrorizing girls and young women across California and Nevada. Their crimes were characterized by prosecutors as acts of utter depravity that shocked even experienced investigators. That December morning, DiVeggio and Michaud were driving in Michaud's green Dodge minivan when they spotted Vanessa walking alone. They pulled alongside her and somehow convinced her to get into their vehicle, perhaps offering help or directions, as they had done with previous victims. Once Vanessa was inside the van, her nightmare began. The couple drove toward Lake Tahoe, assaulting Vanessa repeatedly during the journey with modified curling irons in acts too brutal to describe in detail. When they were finished with their torture, they strangled her with a rope, and 2 days later, Vanessa's body was found in the snow on an embankment along Highway 88 in Alpine County. The discovery ended a frantic search by her family and friends, but began a complex investigation that would reveal the couple's horrific crime spree. DiVeggio and Michaud were arrested by the FBI on December 3, 1997, just 1 day after Vanessa's murder. Initially, they were arrested on federal kidnapping charges related to another case, the September 29th assault of a 20-year-old Reno college student who had been kidnapped and assaulted in a similar manner. Like Vanessa, this victim had been walking by the side of a road when she was abducted into their van, but she had survived to tell investigators about her attackers. As the investigation expanded, the true scope of DiVeggio and Michaud's crimes became apparent. During their 2002 trial in Alameda County, prosecutors were allowed to present testimony from additional victims, including some who were children when they were assaulted. 2 of the alleged victims who testified were Michaud's own daughter and a friend of the daughter, who were just 12 and 13 years old when they were allegedly forced into sexual acts by the couple in the fall of 1997. The couple had also been convicted of sexual assault involving DiVeggio's 16-year-old daughter and her 17-year-old friend in November 1997. Superior Court Judge Larry Goodman allowed prosecutors to present testimony from 4 alleged victims of uncharged 1997 assaults, though he excluded evidence of alleged attacks on 11 other victims. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic predation on vulnerable girls and young women, with the couple using Michaud's van as a mobile torture chamber. After a lengthy trial, both DiVeggio and Michaud were convicted of murder, kidnapping, and rape. Judge Goodman sentenced both to death, calling Vanessa's murder vile, cruel, senseless, depraved, brutal, evil, and vicious. The California Supreme Court unanimously upheld their death sentences in a 98-page decision that rejected a series of appeal arguments. Justice Leandra Kruger wrote that testimony about uncharged incidents was admissible to show the distinctive characteristics of the couple's motive and methods. The court found that the evidence concerning the uncharged incidents shed light on whether DiVeggio and Michaud had a propensity to commit acts of sexual misconduct. Both defendants remain on California's death row as of 2024, more than 2 decades after their convictions. Michaud is one of only 23 women among the 746 inmates on death row in California. DiVeggio and Michaud have never been executed. There are no final words or last meals to record because both are still alive, continuing their appeals through the federal court system. California's death penalty system has become notorious for lengthy delays, with most death row inmates spending decades in appeals before any execution occurs, if it occurs at all. The average time between sentencing and execution in California exceeds 25 years, and many death row inmates die of natural causes or have their sentences overturned before facing execution. Their case represents the modern reality of death penalty prosecutions, lengthy legal processes that can stretch for decades while victims' families wait for closure that may never come. The crimes of James DiVeggio and Michelle Michaud remind us that evil can take many forms, and that some criminal partnerships are built not on love or ideology, but on shared depravity that destroys innocent lives. While justice may have been served in the form of life sentences without possibility of parole, the ultimate punishment both received remains uncarried out, leaving their story unfinished in the annals of criminal couples who faced death row together. What did you think about today's cases? Let me know, and remember to check out Aura for free with my link in the comments and description of this video to get a free trial and see who is selling your information online. Thank you for watching.